All right, thank you guys so much for joining today. My name is Amanda Saunders. I'm a medical officer with the MSSO. Liz and I are happy to have you with us today for this session on the SNOMED CT MedDRA Maps. Many of you are joining from organizations perhaps that aren't as familiar with MedDRA, so we'll spend a little bit of time just kind of going through the two different terminologies. And I do anticipate having some questions that you will have the ability to interact with using our Poll Everywhere software. So I'm going to show some instructions on how to join the Poll Everywhere software a little bit later into the presentation. But there will be a way for you to respond to questions that I show throughout the course of the presentation. This webinar is designed to last no more than an hour, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to respond to your questions that may have led you to attend or to register for this webinar. So throughout the course of the webinar, should you have questions, there is a question panel in your GoToWebinar interface, and I would encourage you to enter those questions. Liz will help me at the end of the session. We'll go through those questions and I'll answer as many of them as I can. And then you will have hopefully the information you need to use the maps for your organization. For those of you who may not be aware, MedDRA is owned by the ICH, and the content that I will be presenting today is copyright protected, and that copyright belongs to the ICH. So you may use the slides that I present, but please acknowledge the ownership of them. This is that polling software that I was mentioning to you earlier. It's called Poll Everywhere. You can join it through a browser in your smartphone or a separate browser in your computer. Simply open up the web page, go to the web page www.pollev.com. There you will be prompted to join a session or presentation, and you will enter A. Saunders, MSSO, and click Join. If you are prompted to enter information about yourself, you can skip that, as we do not track or monitor the responses to any of the activities. So you will be completely anonymous in your responses. So I'll give you all a moment to do that if you'd like. Once you have successfully navigated your way into the polling software, you will be presented with a map for you to drop a pin where you are joining the webinar today. So that lets you know that you have successfully joined the polling session. I'll also take a moment to let you know that Liz has appended the slide deck in a PDF under the handouts pane on the GoToWebinar interface. So you will be able to click that link and download the PDF for the files, for the slides that I'll be using. You might notice that there might be some changes in the order of the slides, but the content is all there. So I would encourage you to do that. If you don't have a chance to do that during the webinar, the slides are posted on the MedDRA.org website as well. So you can get them at the website if you forget to download them now during the session. So again, Poll Everywhere, you just enter the A. Saunders MSSO and click Join. You do not need to put in any information about yourself. And once you see a map and you have the ability to drop a pin, you know that you have successfully navigated your way into the polling software. I don't have a lot of these slides. I have several at the end. If we have time, we'll go through. But it's nice for us to be able to see who's on the line with us today. You can see that we have individuals from North America and Europe joining, as well as some individuals from Asia Pacific. So welcome to all of you. We're glad that you made the time to join this session today. So the next question I have for you is just to get an understanding of how familiar you are with different terminology systems. And this is largely because, as I mentioned, we opened up the registration for this webinar to individuals who are not MedDRA subscribers. So it will be very helpful for me to understand which terminologies you're familiar with, and you can indicate as many of those that apply to your organization. Great. So as I suspected, there's over half of you that are not using MedDRA regularly. We'll use some time during the presentation to talk about MedDRA as well, so that I can make sure you understand MedDRA as well as SNOMED CT going into the maps themselves. Great. Thank you so much for your responses. So in today's session, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about MedDRA and SNOMED CT. I'm going to walk through the methodology for the development of the maps and then move into the maintenance process and give you a couple of spots that you can go to for additional information following this webinar. In around early 2019, the SNOMED International and the MSSO organizations initiated a mapping project under the IMI project with the MHRA. And this mapping project started with a list of over 7,000 LLTs that represented the most commonly reported events in the user vigilance system. This initial set included approximately 80% of all content in user vigilance, and so the directionality of the production release map is from MedDRA to SNOMED CT and then SNOMED CT back to MedDRA. The first production release was on April 30th of this year, so it took us a couple years to appropriately map and validate the maps that had been created, but we were very excited to announce this collaboration and the results of this collaboration to the global community. So first, let me just give you a brief introduction to what MedDRA is. MedDRA is a clinically validated international terminology used in the regulated biopharmaceutical and medical device industry. It is used in over 120 countries, and all content within MedDRA is translated into the 14 languages that we presently support. Organizations or individuals subscribe to MedDRA in order to access the content and all of the supporting tools. The MedDRA hierarchy is a 5-level hierarchy arranged from very specific to general categories. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen a representation of our hierarchy with the lowest level term being the most granular and then being organized in a variety of levels up into the most broad category of system organ class. Now, the MedDRA hierarchy also has multi-axiality built into the structure, and this multi-axiality allows a term to be represented in more than one SOC and to be grouped by different classifications, allowing retrieval and presentation via different data sets. This is a difference that will become critical when we talk about the map between MedDRA and SNOMED CT. The concept is a unique concept that, in other words, the LLT is unique, but it has multiple hierarchies that it can belong to. This is slightly different from the SNOMED CT organization, and we'll get to that in just a moment. This is a screenshot of our web-based browser that is available to MedDRA subscribers. This provides a very user-friendly, easy way to navigate through the terminology, and this similar to our desktop browser, these are available to our subscribers as part of the subscription. Now let's talk about SNOMED CT. SNOMED CT is a clinical healthcare terminology used in electronic health records. It is used in more than 50 countries, and it has the members who use SNOMED CT through a national registration model as opposed to the MedDRA subscription model. Now with SNOMED CT, the international edition is the primary content that is managed by SNOMED International. It's designed to allow this international edition to be enhanced by adding extensions to meet national or local requirements without compromising the main body of SNOMED CT. This is intended to meet the different specialties and countries, regions, vendors, and different institutions and meet all of their needs. But it's important that you recognize that these are in fact extensions. So unlike MedDRA, in which all content is translated into all languages, the international edition is the primary content or the core, and there might be concepts within the extensions that don't exist in the international edition. This is a depiction from the SNOMED International website of the SNOMED CT structure. So you can see that the SNOMED CT structure focuses on hierarchy as well, with concepts organized into these top-level hierarchies. There are a variety of relationships and attributes that are built into the various concepts. The core concept, if you will, is an FSN, or fully specified name, and I'll show you some examples of that as we move through the presentation. Ultimately, what I would like for you to take away from this, as well as the MedDRA structure slide, is that the two terminologies are organized differently, and we have to consider that as we build the maps, and so it'll be important that you're aware of it as you utilize the maps. This is a screenshot of the SNOMED CT browser, which looks similar to the browser for MedDRA. However, you'll notice at the top, there is a green box where you might see a variety of the local editions or the extensions. So it's important that if you are working within the maps that you are referencing the international edition. So now let's look at the two structures compared to one another a little bit more granularly. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the MedDRA structure. This is a screenshot from our browser, our web-based browser, looking at the concept, the LLT highlighted abdominal aneurysm. On the right-hand side, a similar screen grab from the SNOMED CT browser, looking at the similar concept of abdominal aneurysm. For the purposes of the MedDRA SNOMED map, we mapped LLTs, so the highlighted abdominal aneurysm, to the fully specified name, or FSN. And the fully specified name has its own SCT ID that you see kind of in the center of that blue box on the right-hand side of the screen. The LLT to PT relationship is similar to the synonym or fully specified name relationship in SNOMED CT. So while we mapped LLT to FSN, in some situations, synonyms were used to inform that mapping. So the idea behind developing a map really stemmed around the ease of data transfer and data sharing among a variety of different parts of healthcare and development and regulatory organizations. So the map itself is designed to support regulatory, clinical, PV, pharmacoepi, public health, scientific, and academic needs. A real-world requirement, if you will, for utilizing the map might be to support surveillance on a black box warning, for example, from the regulatory perspective. On the right-hand side of the screen, however, is a different use case for a real-world use of the maps, and that is adverse event surveillance in electronic health records. Oftentimes, information is captured in an electronic health record using SNOMED CT, FSNs, and this information could be very useful for the purposes of surveilling or pharmacovigilance work, looking for different adverse events that have occurred for patients taking specific medications. And this information would be coded in SNOMED CT, so the map would enable the data to be converted, if you will, into MedDRA for use in the regulated biopharmaceutical space. Vice versa, labels are created in MedDRA terminology in most regions, and so utilizing the MedDRA to SNOMED map would enable different clinical decision-making support tools to be put into place in electronic health records, which focus on SNOMED CT. As we developed the map, we had to be aware of the fact that what we are doing is looking at the way a medical concept is represented in the two terminologies and then linking the two in the form of the map. It's important that if you have not worked in maps before, that you understand this concept that we are not coding, we are in fact mapping. And it is slightly different because we do have to take into consideration the different structures of the two terminologies when we do this. As I mentioned before, LLTs were mapped to FSNs, oftentimes utilizing synonyms to figure out which FSN was the most suitable map. Because of this, you will see that there is a difference in the number of MedDRA to SNOMED maps versus SNOMED to MedDRA maps. And this is a slide to help illustrate why that has occurred. On the very most left-hand side of the slide, you see 3 different LLTs: chest discomfort, chest distressed feeling, and chest heaviness. All 3 of these were ultimately mapped to the single FSN of chest discomfort finding. And then, because those FSNs become the source for the SNOMED to MedDRA map, one LLT was selected to map chest discomfort finding, and that is the chest discomfort LLT. So you can see that just by nature of this relationship, the MedDRA to SNOMED map contains more individual mapped terms than the SNOMED to MedDRA direction. And this is, again, because that target becomes the starting point for the reverse map. The map was and is bi-directional. And I think the way I kind of phrase this is that the round trip doesn't always get you back to the place you started. So it's important to just be aware of that if you're utilizing the bi-directional maps, that you understand kind of how where you start is going to impact where you end up. Now, you can imagine that this would create some situations where there could be differences of interpretation. And so the mapping conventions were developed alongside of the mapping process throughout the mapping process to ensure that mapping was done in a standardized way across the board. We had independent blinded mappers who were mapping each individual term, and then there were quality checks from both organizations that occurred at the next level. And all of this was to ensure a standard product at the end of the process. Ultimately, we're hoping for an exact conceptual match in which the source terminology and the target terminology have the exact same conceptual medical meaning. It's nice when it works out that there's semantic matching as well, and that's always very convenient. However, we found that there were situations in which this was not the case, and so we had to make conventions around differences in spelling and punctuation, and then a variety of conventions addressing special circumstances. MedDRA contains both UK and US spellings, and so we had to come up with conventions around how to handle that when considering that SNOMED CT uses the US spellings only. We also decided that punctuation would be irrelevant in making these maps. Now, the special circumstances include things like qualified tests and investigations, tumors and staging, and combination terms, including infection and body site combination terms. This was largely due to the fact that the two terminologies handled these concepts differently, represented them differently within their terminology. So we had to ensure that we were matching or mapping like for like. Now, in the red boxes, there are two things to be aware of as a user of the maps. There were a variety of terms or categories of terms that were determined to be out of scope. On the MedDRA side of things, unqualified test names and NOS terms were determined to be out of scope for purposes of the map. On the SNOMED CT side, substances, qualifier values, pharmaceutical and biologic products, environment and geographical location categories were examples of some of the areas of the terminology that were determined to be out of scope. Again, this is largely due to the fact that the two terminologies are made to address different needs, and therefore these particular areas fell out of scope for the other terminology. There were a number of terms that could not be appropriately mapped according to the principles agreed, and these were determined to be unmappable. in the final map products that are available on the SNOMED CT or SNOMED International and the MedDRA.org website, you will not see any of these terms that were designated as unmappable, but there were a percentage of terms that were designated as unmappable. So now let's walk through how we are building the maps using some, I kind of call it a direct, a tricky, and then a complex example. So this is a direct match, which makes for a very easy map. MedDRA represents the medical concept or the verbatim at the LLT level. Patient experienced nausea, and that LLT, there is an LLT that matches that verbatim nausea text. Now, SNOMED CT represents this medical concept verbatim at the FSN level, and it can be in multiple parts of the structure of the terminology. So the decision here is that we have mapped to the FSN of nausea finding. So in this situation, the LLT of nausea mapped to nausea finding in SNOMED CT, and when we do the reverse direction, nausea finding maps back to LLT of nausea. Pretty straightforward, but now let's look at an example that's a little bit trickier. So represented at the verbatim level, or the verbatim concept at the LLT level in MedDRA, the patient has metastatic colon cancer. This was a scenario that we had some conventions around in our conventions document. So I would encourage you to take some time to familiarize yourself with this. But for purposes of this example, metastatic colon cancer was ultimately mapped to the FSN of metastasis from malignant tumor of colon disorder. In this situation, you have to understand the way that MedDRA and SNOMED CT are representing metastatic cancer concepts. And you have to understand the difference between metastasis from and metastasis to. When we do the reverse direction, metastasis from malignant tumor of colon disorder into MedDRA, we make our way right back into metastatic colon cancer. Now, this is a more complex example demonstrating the need to understand not only the terminology construct, but also the medical concepts that are being described. So on the left-hand side, the physician noted neurodermatitis on the dorsum of the hand, and this would be represented in a MedDRA-coded data set as neurodermatitis. The same concept represented in a SNOMED CT data set would have a variety of options to choose from. Simply looking for neurodermatitis, you would find things like Rox neurodermatitis, local neurodermatitis, atopic neurodermatitis, circumscribed neurodermatitis. And these are actually synonyms of the FSN that you see here, lichen simplex chronicus. So the concept of neurodermatitis LLT was mapped in through local neurodermatitis to the FSN of lichen simplex chronicus disorder. Now, when we do the reverse direction, we no longer map directly to neurodermatitis because there is an LLT available in MedDRA for lichen simplex chronicus. So this would map back into that LLT. So you can see how it's not only an understanding of the terminologies, but it's also an understanding of the medical concepts that are being reported through these different data sets that is required in order to perform maps that will work and hopefully not lose a significant amount of information. So I'm just going to pause for a moment here. We're about halfway through the content that I have. Just to remind you that if you have questions, please feel free to put those in the question panel in the GoToWebinar interface, and we will address all of the questions at the end of the session, but please ask them as you think of them. So a little bit about the actual maps and the mapping files. As I mentioned, the SNOMED CT MedDRA mapping is a bidirectional map of a subset of MedDRA and SNOMED CT terms, and we have based this map on the International Edition release of SNOMED CT, which happens in January, as well as the MedDRA September release. The first production release occurred in April of this year, And really the maps, and I'll show you an example in a moment, the maps are on the MedDRA.org side of things are simply Excel files available in the download section of MedDRA.org. For SNOMED CT users, you are familiar with the RF2 format, and those files are available to you however you get your SNOMED CT content. In order for the map to be appropriately maintained and further expanded, there have to be clear use cases for using the maps and using the terms that are being requested in the maps. And I'll talk to you about the change request maintenance process in a few moments. The maps themselves will undergo annual maintenance for purposes of up-versioning to the next September release of MedDRA and January release of SNOMED CT. But expansion of the maps is really going to be up to you, the users of the map. And that will be handled through a change request process. The MSSO has developed a new tool called MapCR for users of the maps to propose additions or revisions to the mapping files. And this change request process will occur throughout the year. This tool, the MapCR tool, is accessible by both SNOMED CT users as well as MedDRA users. So regardless of whether or not you have a subscription or you are a member of both, if you are a member or subscriber to either, you can access the MapCR tool. And I'll show you through that process as well. So as I mentioned, for MedDRA users, we make the files available in Excel spreadsheets. You can see they are pretty straightforward. 4 columns, code and LLT for MedDRA, code and FSN for SNOMED. And then there are 2 tabs within the workbook, one in the MedDRA to SNOMED direction and the other in the SNOMED to MedDRA direction. Now, as I mentioned, you can see the dramatic difference in the numbers for the MedDRA to SNOMED versus SNOMED to MedDRA direction, and that relates back to that slide that we talked about for chest discomfort and how the LLTs and FSNs are slightly different with regard to granularity. And again, for the SNOMED CT users, you have RF2 files available to you however you normally access your RF2 files. Again, for MedDRA users, you can access the maps in the download section of MedDRA.org. That, as you can see, there is a heading, a subheading for the SNOMED CT MedDRA mapping release package. And in that package, you will find the release notes as well as the Excel spreadsheet or the Excel workbook that I just showed you with the 2 spreadsheets. This Excel workbook can be formatted in whatever format you might need through simple file conversion software or just by using a simple save as. So if you are needing to make a conversion, you should be able to do that fairly easily. As far as finding access to the mapping information regarding the mapping files, that information is available to you on the tools page of MedDRA.org. Clicking on how to use and then mapping, and that will get you to this page, which as you can see, there is a gray box indicated by the arrow on the right-hand side of your screen, and this has a link to the MapCR application. It has instructions for use of the for the MapCR tool. It also has information around the criteria for accepting change requests, and it has that conventions document that I mentioned. And this, again, is freely accessible to, this part of the website is freely accessible regardless of your MedDRA subscriber status. So if you are interested in accessing these files, you can do that here. And they are available also on the SNOMED International website if you are more familiar with functioning or navigating through that website. So as I mentioned before, the map will undergo ongoing annual maintenance for purposes of content that has already been established in the production release. This maintenance process will involve up-versioning to the next X.1 version that gets released in September, and the SNOMED CT International Edition that will be released in January. Throughout the course of the year, however, we will have ongoing maintenance for purposes of expansion or revision to the maps as requested by you, the user community. In order to influence the expansion or revision of a map in either MedDRA to SNOMED or SNOMED to MedDRA direction, you will submit a change request through our MapCR tool. In order to submit a change request, you must be a licensed user of MedDRA or in a member country or affiliate in a non-member country for SNOMED International. You must demonstrate that you are going to be using one or both of the maps within the next year in the form of your use case or rationale statement. Your use case should be comprehensive enough that we understand the need for adding terms to the map. A good example of a use case might be the need to monitor a new risk that has been identified for a particular product, and you are going to be doing some sort of either technology or something that you are working with, another data set that is coded in the alternative terminology. Simply requesting that we expand the map to add an entire HLT or an entire category within SNOMED CT will not be accepted as a change request. So it's important that you give us the information that you have regarding why you need to expand the map in this way. Out of scope areas for inclusion in the map are listed here. There are others. Medication errors is not completely out of scope. We do have some medication errors that are in both terminologies, but SNOMED CT doesn't have medication errors the way that MedDRA has, and that's largely related to the requirements for regulatory reporting that MedDRA supports. So while there are some medication errors, there will not be a comprehensive mapping of medication errors between MedDRA and SNOMED CT. Now, this change request process is not an alternative to requesting new terminology be added. So if you are requesting new content to be added to either MedDRA or SNOMED CT as a terminology, you will need to follow each organization's terminology request process. We can only map terminology that exists. So if the terminology that you are looking for is not within the actual browser terminology browsers, then you will need to make your request through the browser or through the content request process with each organization. So the MapCR tool, while it requires your user credentials, you can use your MedDRA or SNOMED credentials, and this will enable you to request addition of term or terms to the map in either direction. You are limited to 50 terms within a batch, that's just a restriction that we have applied for purposes of resourcing. You can add multiple batches, each with 50 change requests if that's what you require, but that is our cutoff as far as considerations for resourcing strategy. When you request a revision to an existing map, this is a one-for-one, so you have to have one change request at a time because you do have to provide us with your rationale for why that specific term requires a revision. The other nice function in MapCR is the ability to search other requests that have been submitted. And this might enable you to understand perhaps if a term that you're requesting, if it's been requested before, you might be able to see rationale around why it may not have been accepted previously. You are required when submitting an addition to either direction to indicate the source terminology, and then for any SNOMED terms, you provide us with the SCT ID of the term that you're requesting, and for MedDRA, you can provide either the code or the LLT. This is largely because specific text within the FSN might be present in multiple places with multiple IDs. So we need to know the exact ID for the FSN that you're requesting be added or revised in the map. This is a screenshot of the MapCR tool. So once you have logged into the MapCR tool, this is the screen that you will be presented with. You can see across the top of the screen, you have the ability to add a map, revise the map, or search, the other two functions that you see on the right-hand side of the screen are not available for general users of the MapCR tool. Again, you will need to add some basic demographic information for us so that we can contact you if we have questions about your request. And this email address will be the one that receives the final notification after the process has been completed. So this should be the person who is most closely related to the mapping project, because we are going to send the map, any of the maps that we create or reject, or if something is unmappable, all of that information is going to go back to this individual. So it's important that that not be some high-level point of contact within your organization that doesn't even know you submitted a change request. It really should be someone who is aware of the request and the need for the request and the need for the requested terms. There are a variety of checks within these different boxes to ensure that you request terms that have not been mapped previously or rejected previously, and there will be various prompts that will guide you through that in the event that you ask for terms that have already been mapped. Now, the production map, so a complete mapping file, will only be made available in the April release. But because we are performing this type of maintenance or these types of additions throughout the year, supplemental files will be made available. So when you are the person requesting, you will get the email back letting you know what the maps are, and you will have a document appended to that email that gives you the maps. You will have to manually add that to the full mapping product because that won't happen until the next production release. The supplemental mapping, the different mapping relationships that are created in between April and April production releases will be available in the download section of the MedDRA.org website. And those supplementals will be made available as they are available. We anticipate this will be, this mapping process will occur monthly. However, it's driven by the change request. So if there are months that we don't receive change requests, obviously there would not be a supplemental made available at that time. So just important to think about that, that those supplemental files will be made available, but they will not be comprised, they will not be represented in the full production release until the next year. Okay, so we have some time to run through some examples using the Poll Everywhere software. So I thought you could practice being a mapper now. And so you have had some introduction to the way these maps are formed, and I think that it would be great to kind of try your hand at it. So if you navigate back to your Poll Everywhere software, wherever you have that open, you should see this question appear on your screen. And what I would ask you to do is to select the term. So we are given an LLT, so this is a MedDRA term, and what we need to do is select the SNOMED CT FSN that you believe would be the appropriate map for the term bowel ischemia. And while you're thinking about that one, I will ask Liz. Liz, do we have questions at this time?
Yes, there are several questions.
Okay, perfect. So let me, I'll do this one and then we'll take some questions.
Okay.
So I make sure I have time to answer all of those. Okay, great. So let me show you. Oh, there's some of you still responding, sorry. Okay. All right, perfect. So the correct answer here is the vascular insufficiency of intestine disorder. And for those of you who selected intestinal ischemia, and this is probably just maybe learning SNOMED CT, but the SNOMED CT FSN contains the parentheses text as well. So the FSN is the entire FSN includes that parentheses text. So intestinal ischemia is actually not an FSN, but you can see that vascular insufficiency of intestine parentheses disorder is in the format of an appropriate FSN. So Yeah, so that's just an example of kind of a way that we have created these maps. And I would encourage you to kind of look at that in the browser because you'll see some of the synonyms that might help guide you. All right, cool. So Liz, let's take some questions just to make sure, since we've got about 20 minutes left, I want to make sure we have time for all the questions.
Okay, the first question is sort of multi.
Okay.
How often do you release new versions of MedDRA? And will you be releasing MedDRA and SNOMED mappings together from now on, e.g. every 6 months in line with SNOMED releases? And the third part of that question is, regarding the new releases, how long does it take MedDRA to produce a revised mapping?
Sure. Great. So we talked a little bit about this, but just for confirmation. So MedDRA is actually updated twice a year, so September and March. The maps will be built on the September version prior, and we will only be releasing the full mapping files once a year in April. And that April release will be built on the September version of MedDRA and the January international edition of SNOMED CT. So those files will be released once a year, but the supplemental maps will be made available, at least for our MedDRA user community, in the download section of the MedDRA.org website. I think I got all of them. Was that all of them, Liz? I think I got all three parts.
I think, how long does it take MedDRA to produce a revised mapping?
Oh, sure. So the maintenance process itself actually begins in January. That's the kind of up-versioning, if you will, once the SNOMED CT International Edition has been released. And it takes us a couple of months, up to 2 months, to get that information up-versioned and turned around into the appropriate format. But for purposes of adding to the map, if you are interested in using the maps, but you find that you have terms that you need added and you have an immediate need for them, that's where that change request process comes in. And those supplementals will be made available to you as soon as the maps themselves are created. So those particular terms you've requested have been mapped. And that information will be made available back to the user who requested them, so that you would be able to then manually add them to your mapping file and then have a comprehensive mapping file.
The next question, how many LLTs and FSNs are there in the map?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to jump back to that slide. Give me 1 second. All right. So in the MedDRA to SNOMED CT direction, there are 6,467 LLTs and FSN kind of relationships, if you will. And in the SNOMED CT to MedDRA direction, there are 3,729 LLTs and FSN relationship records, if you will. Now, as far as what number in totality is represented, I don't know that number, but in the MedDRA to SNOMED direction, you can see that there are almost double what's in the SNOMED CT to MedDRA direction.
The next question, what are the timelines for requesting new maps?
Yeah, so the timeline is really related to the need of in your organization. So if you are requesting new maps or revisions to existing maps, you'll do that through the MapCR process. And those individual requests will be kind of taken through the mapping process. The hope is that we would be able to complete all of those requests within 30 days of receiving them. However, depending on when you submit them versus when we perform the mapping, it could be a little bit longer than that. But that is the hope, that we would be able to turn those around fairly quickly for people. Again, there are caveats, of course. If we determine that new content is required for either terminology, that will then, of course, delay the process of mapping.
The next question, will the Excel file maps be available to non-licensed users of MedDRA?
So unfortunately, the Excel files are available in our download section of the MedDRA.org website. So in order to access that section, you have to be a subscriber to MedDRA. If you are a SNOMED CT user, I believe that the files are only made available to you in RF2 format.
The next question. Can you explain again, what do you mean by must demonstrate using both of the maps within the next year on submitting a CR slide?
Of course, yeah. So the idea here is that in your rationale that you provide in the MapCR tool, let me show you where that box is so that it's a little bit, there we go. So in this rationale, you would want to let us know, for example, we are attempting to perform, a whatever project that is due by October of 2021, utilizing the SNOMED to MedDRA direction map. This would enable us to allocate resourcing appropriately to meet or to attempt to meet your needs for your timelines. Otherwise, our overarching timeline is to have everything processed by the next April, or I guess the next kind of March, to get ready for the April release. So, if you have a more pressing need, it's important to just include that information in your rationale.
The next question. The mapping approaches used are automatic based on UMLS? Question mark.
No. So the process actually involved dual independent blinded mappers, individual human beings who mapped the terms in teams. So every term was mapped. Ultimately, every term was mapped 4 times, and then all of that information was aggregated and reviewed to determine what the best appropriate map was. And that again was done by human beings. We had representatives who were expert users of MedDRA, as well as and then other individuals who were experts in SNOMED CT, and some individuals who had familiarity with both terminologies, all working to complete the maps. So it was not an automated process at all. It was 100% done by human mappers.
The next question. Will the yearly map updates just consist of the monthly supplemental maps?
No, it will be a full new production release. So it would include any change requests that were ultimately added or revised, and it will also include any changes to the existing maps that resulted from any ongoing maintenance performed by either of the 2 terminologies. For example, if MedDRA determined that an LLT should be made non-current, that term will then be removed from the map. And so that information would all be in the April production release. So the April production release will be the comprehensive map of all changes, all revisions, all additions that have occurred over the last 365 days.
The next question. Can you give some examples of when you would need to map from MedDRA to SNOMED or the other way around?
Sure. So let me jump to my use case slide here. So the idea behind the maps is that there are different data sets available that contain information that would be beneficial to the other. So in the example on the bottom right, this is a kind of a graphic depiction of a patient going in to talk to their healthcare provider about a rash that has appeared or whatever. I don't know what it is on here on the slide, but this issue with their arm, this rash, talking to the prescriber about that in the clinic setting. And this information would all be entered into an electronic medical record. And that electronic medical record uses SNOMED CT for recording that information. Now, if I am the manufacturer of that medication that was taken in close temporality with this rash that the healthcare provider has determined might have caused this rash, that information would be useful to me from a surveillance perspective. So if I were to obtain information from an electronic medical record, I could convert that over into the MedDRA terminology so that I could utilize it to support regulatory submissions around pharmacovigilance. Now, the opposite is true. So if this particular medication contains a warning for severe rash that could occur on this product, that information would be in a MedDRA term. So there are companies that are working on taking those MedDRA terms and converting them across to SNOMED CT terminology to aid in clinical decision-making at the point of care in the physician's office. So the patient comes in and reports a rash, the physician documents it, or the provider documents it in the electronic medical record, and perhaps there's a warning box that appears that says, in case you didn't know, this drug can cause this type of rash. So these are the kind of things that we have heard from individuals who are interested in using the maps or are already using the maps. You can also imagine that there are ways to incorporate the two data sets so that you could perhaps create a natural history conversation around a particular disease process, or look for incidence and prevalence in an electronic medical record data set utilizing MedDRA terminology. So those are some examples.
The next question. Would there be any interest in demoing a new semantic web AI which can automatically remap between MedDRA and SNOMED? In one example, the AI has processed a SNOMED mapping in 3 business days for a drug pricing firm.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, we're aware that there are a variety of software packages that can perform these types of automated mappings, but the decision was made in the SNOMED International and the MedDRA groups that utilizing human mappers who were very familiar with the structure and the context of these types of terms, that we would be providing the mapping.
The next question. Will we be able to access a recently requested mapping?
Yes, so you can either do that just through the supplementals that will be available for MedDRA users, and then you can also do that through the MapCR process. So let me show you again on that screenshot, just because I think that's the easiest way to understand it. All right, here we go. So in this search change request function in the middle of my screen, but it'll be the end of your blue menu bar when you open this, you could search for a term, a specific term that you're interested in seeing. You could also search for any terms that have been approved and added into the map. There are a variety of searches you can perform. So if you're not looking for a specific thing, I would suggest accessing the supplemental files. If you are not able to access the supplemental files, then this search change request functionality would get you to the answers that you need.
The next question. Can you explain how legacy terms that might be changed, removed in each terminology will be identified in future releases?
Sure. So there will be this concept of maps that become inactivated or no longer effective. And so that is the way that we will be able to kind of follow the audit trail, if you will, as terms get changed or get removed from the maps. So I hope that helps. But I would always encourage users, if you are utilizing the map for a project, you save the file, the mapping files that you utilized at the time of your project, so that you would have the ability to utilize exactly the data that you had at the time when you did the project. And that would enable reproducibility.
The next question. What about the maintenance of promotions of LLTs into PTs in future MedDRA-SNOMED CT mappings?
Sure. So that's where the annual maintenance process comes in. So both organizations will work together for any changes made to our terminologies that might impact the maps. And all of that will be handled through the annual maintenance process that will begin kind of in January. And that's how we will handle promotions and demotions and inactivations and non-currents. So if an LLT is promoted to a PT, this really won't impact the maps per se, because the LLT is what's contained in the map. And as you know, every PT has a corresponding matching LLT. So ultimately, that shouldn't be an issue. But for purposes of things that get demoted, or, well, I guess that wouldn't matter either really, but currency is going to be the biggest one. So for LLTs that are made non-current or FSNs that are inactivated, that will happen through the maintenance process.
The next question. SNOMED CT terms are going to be used in MedDRA vigilance for ICSR submission? Question mark.
Oh, okay. No, not that I'm aware of. No. The idea is that, you know, your ICSR submissions would use MedDRA, and then this would enable you to take SNOMED CT data and take it into MedDRA coded data. I think I understood that question right. So.
And we don't have any other questions coming in.
Okay, great. Well, I can't thank you all enough for attending and for your engagement and for your interest in the maps. We are always interested in hearing from you about ways you're using the map or things that you encounter as you use the maps. So please feel free to reach out to us if there are things that you encounter. Our help desk is always available for our MedDRA subscribers, and I know SNOMED CT, you have the same kind of idea with the help desk or with the help email address that you can access. I would encourage you in your polling software, there is now a webinar feedback form that has appeared. It's, I think, 4 or 5 questions that are very quick to answer, and your responses will be very useful in understanding how useful this webinar was, and if there are additional things that we could offer that would support your use of this mapping product. So I hope you will take a moment to complete that survey. The survey will stay active for about a day following the webinar.
There is some additional information about the ICSR submissions.
Okay.
E2BR3 defines MedDRA as terminology to be used with ICSR reporting.
Right. Thank you for that. Yep. So the mapping at MedDRA.org email address can be utilized if you have specific requests around or questions around mapping. However, we will not be able to process change requests that get emailed to us. All change requests will have to go through the MapCR process. So if you submit change requests to our email address, you're going to get a response back saying you have to put them in the MapCR process. But if you do have questions and you would like to speak to either myself or my colleague Nicole, we are actively monitoring that website, that email address, and are happy to answer questions as they come up. But we look forward to all the great things that the user community will be able to do with this mapping product. And if there are no other questions.
Nope, there are no other questions.
Then we will wrap up this session. And again, like Liz mentioned, the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel and website in the days following this webinar.